And on this panel, we have got some great speakers. We've got the moderator, Linnea Skärdin. Apologies if my Swedish isn't great, Linnea. She is the leader in AI for cybersecurity from Darktrace. Then we have got Gazmend Huskaj. He's the head of cybersecurity cluster, Geneva Center for Security Policy. We also have Oleksii Baranovskyi, Ph.D, CISSP. It's a lot, actually, so I'll let you a bit later. From Blekinge Tekniska Högskola. And we also have Katarina Kandolin, expert cybersecurity from OP Financial Group. And last but not the least, we have got Thomas Lund Sørensen, the partner at Market Advisory Partners and former head of the National Center of Cybersecurity. Welcome, guys. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Linnea. Take it away, and good luck.
Thank you so much. Hi everyone. My name is Linnea. I'm working for Darktrace as a cyber technology specialist. I'm the moderator for today's discussion about cyber warfare and how to dodge the digital bullet, basically. We'll focus on the current threat landscape, first of all, with the situation in Ukraine and Russia, of course. We'll also focus on the future threat landscape, but also how businesses and governments have to tackle these issues, how they're tackling them today, but also in the future, how we are going to manage these difficult questions. Welcome, everyone. I think we have a good team of experts around the table today. I thought perhaps we should start with you, Oleksii. Sorry for putting you on the spot, but you have unique knowledge in the current situation between Ukraine and Russia. Maybe you can start with giving us a brief overview of what you've seen, well, specifically with the situation this spring, but also past, well.
Okay, sure, thank you, Linnea. Dear colleagues, as far as you all know, for today we have a war in my native country. We have an invasion from Russian Federation. But frankly speaking, the cyber invasion became much more earlier, starting from 2014, 2015. And from those times we have recognized it as looks like first cyber war operations, etc., etc. But current situation gives us understanding that cyber operations are not something unique here and something focused on, new goals. From current perspective, we could assume that cyber operations are just a part of global war operations. And they, of course, they focus it to reach some goals. And the thing is that we see that our enemies have changed their goals from time to time. If we talk about the previous years, starting from 2014, 15, 16, the goal was to demonstrate something. So we have attacks on water pipe system, we have attacks, very famous attacks to the power grid system, as far as you know, with Black Energy, with Indestroyer, the first. And the goal was to demonstrate something, because to switch off the energy in small region, all right, but it's not it's not so efficient. Impact is not so big. Before the war operations, before the military operations, we had very famous Attack 13, a set of attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, including the information services, with data leakages, with published data leakages, with bulk of data. And the question is, it was exactly before the military operations, 1 month before. So looks like they were focused to destroy their communication, to destroy their trust from nation to the government, to the official entities and special services as well. And for today we have, I've involved in several investigations, and we have a real collaboration between military operations as far as cyber operations. For example, we have a storm of different attacks with Whispergate, Whisperkill, InDestroyer, and etc., etc. I have a list of this malware that sent each day to official entities as far as business, by the way, banking sector, financial sector, I mean, critical infrastructure objects, etc. And if we could assume that for today the goal is the house, to destroy the country, to destroy the system. So it's a house not only for official entities or government, but also for civilian infrastructure, civilian services, and so on. So that's it.
Yeah, I'm going to throw out the question there. Is this the first time we're seeing a cyber war being combined with actual bombing in an actual war? Is it the first time? Any Gazmend, maybe you have some insight on that?
First time?
I would say no.
Yeah.
And why am I saying no? The first time that we saw this was the invasion of Georgia. So what we could see that at that time were a lot of cyber operations that were done months and months ahead of the actual physical operations. And what we could see there that the targets were the communication systems. So what happened first was that the Georgian government could not communicate its version of what was going on to the world, but it had also the inability to communicate with its own people. To solve this, a private company assisted the Georgian government to set up a server hosting Georgian information in the US. What we also saw that just before the tanks were running over, were that all communications were stopped, and at the same time a false flag operation was conducted, which led to that the Georgians fired the first bullet, and this was then used as a pretext to roll over. So this is not the first time. The challenge here is to combine and conduct so-called joint operations, joint military operations. So joint military operations is when you're conducting all of the armed services, the ground forces, air, space, and sea, and cyber. And in the sense that you need a lot of preparation time, but once you hit D-Day and the actual physical components are being conducted on the attacks, you have the physical components going much faster than the actual operations. And this is where you need to have maybe a target list already drafted beforehand, so you know what to shoot at.
I would like to add that 3 or 4 days ago we had this joint operation in a city named Odessa, when the physical bombing was joined with the massive DDoS attack to the information sources of local entities. So
a lot has happened since 2008.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I think that one thing that is constant and that we maybe tend to forget because we are listening to all the events that's taking place in Ukraine, and I must applaud the way that Ukrainians have been able to defend themselves when it comes to cyber. But what is ongoing, and it goes from all conflicts, is of course the intelligence collection. So there's a lot of hacking going on that we not necessarily know about, that we not necessarily discover at the same time as it happens, in difference to DDoS and other kinds of attacks. So a lot of things are going on that we are not seeing now, but we probably will get insights to at a later stage, either during the conflict and after the conflict. But I think that there's a lot of things to be said about what's happening in Ukraine on the cyber side. But there's some new developments that is really interesting. First of all, the Ukrainians have been able to defend themselves much better than we actually had hoped or even expected. And it's really amazing what has been going on. Just look at how the way they've been able to defend the telecommunication systems from kinetic attacks, meaning they were able to very quickly repair and make sure that internet connectivity was still ongoing. So really big applause to Ukrainians working under fire in this aspect. But on the other side, we've seen other elements that is very interesting. I think there's not a single IT security vendor that has not had offered its services to the Ukrainian authorities and helping out and doing an extraordinary job, and I guess without being paid, they're doing that voluntarily. And what is maybe most importantly, we have seen a lot of governments stepping up, even before the invasion took place. EU, the UK, and the US have been working very hard. And what we're seeing now is a total new development of sharing of cyber intelligence to the extent, well, it's unprecedented. And we have only seen that happen one time before, and that's on the terror side. Intelligence agencies have been very good at sharing actionable information on terror, but awfully bad at doing it on cyber. And this is the first time we're actually seeing that on cyber. So looking at that as Ukraine as a precedent, I hope that we will see much more sharing and much more outing of what is going on in this space.
Yeah, Katarina.
Yes, about the question that was this a first, there's actually a claim from already 2007 that the Israelis would have broken into the Syrian air defense systems prior to an air operation. But on the scale that we see in Ukraine today, then no. But this is going to be the new normal, that cyber operations are going to be part of warfare just like any other operations, and even on a larger scale, if you talk about hybrid operations, so information operations is also going to. One thing that I think is interesting is also that cyber operations are also used as information operations. So, I mean, as many of you may know, Finland and Sweden may be joining NATO, and actually the Finnish president and prime minister today said that they think that Finland should join NATO as soon as possible. And one thing that we saw on the very same day that Zelensky was talking to our parliament in Finland, that there were denial of service attacks against our foreign ministry and the defense ministry. Of course, they were against the web pages. It really doesn't affect how the Finnish defense forces work operationally, but they made the headlines. So that's kind of an information operation that is done through a cyber operation.
These are what you're referring to are known as cyber-enabled disinformation operations, and this is also a big perspective shift or differences in how we see this, comparing the West with Russia and China. So we have cyber operations as a domain where we conduct military operations, collection of operations, but both China and Russia, they have it within the information sphere. So the human element and the cognitive is also a target. And we saw that already before the 24th, when the Ukrainian agency websites were being hacked with the information on 3 languages, Russian, Ukrainian, and according to some open sources, the bad Google translation in Polish, where they basically said that we have all of your information and it's out there.
And I think just on the note you mentioned with the information warfare, I think that looking from a Russian perspective, they would probably, if it happens another time, try to target the infrastructure much more heavily in the beginning, because seeing how President Zelensky has been able to communicate, how all of the Ukrainian authorities have been able to communicate, that has really have an impact on the motivation and the rallying behind Ukraine in this. So I think that future perpetrators like Russia will probably target this a little more heavily in the first phase of a war.
Yeah.
I think that targeting the critical infrastructure has been pretty much in Russia's doctrine and the other countries' doctrines, and it's obvious because our society is pretty much dependent on the critical infrastructure, and also the critical infrastructures are dependent of each other. So if you want to bring a society down, then the critical infrastructure is a natural first target. And I don't know, for example, about Sweden, but in Finland, the critical infrastructure has raised now the awareness and kind of expectations, because we are expecting to have cyber operations even more heavily directed at us now during this stage of NATO membership.
And I think it is the future, both like short term and long term. It's not just this period. It's here to stay.
Yeah, it's the new normal.
Yeah, exactly. Oleksii.
Just one comment that we were lucky that our internet was unregulated by government. And that's why Russia wasn't able to switch it off. So, resilience via unregulation.
Well, I think we could call the internet in Ukraine for a spaghetti ball of very
yeah.
connections.
It looks like a phoenix, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the comment earlier about information operations, I mean, in the West we have the Hybrid Center of Excellence in Helsinki, for example, which are doing a really good work on working to develop both doctrine and deterrence strategies. But what we're also seeing here is the combination and the sheer amount, but also an understanding of how to use technology. So, for example, and please correct me here if I'm wrong, but the Ukrainian Minister of Technology or Information is 31, 32 years old. So he goes out on Twitter and said, we're creating an IT army, and then you get 400,000 people, according to the Washington Post. So you have 400,000 people conducting attacks, and then you have the other side. So what these organized criminal groups who say, well, we're supporting Ukraine, and then they go, or Russia, no, we're not supporting Russia, we're supporting Ukraine. So what do these groups do? Then they leak out information on their own operations, what's going. So the sheer amount of people, resources, and also the interconnectedness that we have, I mean, this is just the beginning. In the near future, what we're looking at is how can we automate this? I mean, there are attempts where they have automated the development of spear phishing mails, which is an offensive method targeting the cognitive mindset of an individual, where the accuracy of clicking the link has increased by 80 to 90%. And this is just the start, and we will definitely see more of this. It's here to stay.
For sure. Well, looking at first of all, the near future with governments and with businesses, how are they tackling these problems? How should they handle them, and how are they handling them?
Well, I think that if, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from what's happening in Ukraine, and one of them is exactly to identify what is your critical infrastructure. And we had this example, and I think it's been very well discussed, and it was attributed yesterday, the attack on the Viasat system, or actually some of the modems. And businesses now struggle with understanding, first of all, the threats from the supply chain. Here they were using an internet connection for a large number of wind turbines in Germany. And they were hit by this attack that was actually an attack against the Ukrainian military communications. So looking from a business perspective, how do you know that your critical infrastructure is actually supporting customers that has a very high threat level? That would be really a challenge, and you actually want to know not just who your suppliers are, but also who are the customers of your suppliers, because that could increase your threat for actually losing that service. I think that's one thing that many businesses are going to have a look at. The other thing from a governance perspective, and I used to come from government, so we have been looking quite intensely to this, that this is exactly, are we satisfied with the level of protection within the private sector that runs most of our critical infrastructure? And I feel that we are now looking into a storm of new regulation coming in, setting minimum requirements for cybersecurity in their infrastructure. And that breaks the normal threat model that we have, where we have to do risk assessments and say, okay, you want to turn on that thing and maybe don't need so much security on that other aspect and so on. And now governments are saying, well, it's not good enough. We're going to make sure we all have a baseline that is sufficiently high in order to secure the critical infrastructure that you're running for society. It's sort of the license to operate for private companies. And we're going to see a lot of that. We have seen it in the financial sector for some time, but now it's moving into all kinds of other critical infrastructure sectors.
Katarina?
Well, I think that the first question we should ask is, on a national level, what does it mean to defend a nation also in cyberspace? Because if we are talking about the physical space and somebody sends a missile over, it's quite clear. But what does it mean in cyberspace? And basically, if a cyber attack has the same impact as a physical attack would be, then that could be considered an armed attack, and that means that the nation would be allowed to defend itself. Okay, so what does it mean then? What we would need, first of all, we need to be able to attribute. So to technically be able to say that you did this, but also have the political will to do so. Then we need also the idea that we have countermeasures, and they are not limited to any cyber operations. It can be anything from diplomacy, sanctions, to responding with military means, and everything in between. Then we need to have situational awareness, and this is not only on a government level, talking about what the defense is and the cyber centers is, but also covering especially the critical infrastructures. I have a national cybersecurity picture. Then you also need to have the legislation in place so that you are able to operate. And you need to have the international relations, because again, if your answer would be sanctions, I think it would be much more effective if the sanctions comes, for example, from the EU rather than a single country. So there's a big palette that we have to have in place, but what this means is that it would raise the threshold for another country to attack through cyber means, and this will also add a protectional level to the critical infrastructure. Of course, the critical infrastructure and the other companies still has the responsibility to secure their own functions.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about thresholds, you're actually also into deterrent strategies.
Yeah.
So if you have a deterrent strategy, if a nation has it on place, it means that it has thought of the ways and tools how to use to respond to certain acts. And one really good, there are two good examples on this. The first one is the WannaCry, not Petya cases, where the EU actually used the EU diplomacy toolkit to retaliate in the form of imposing sanctions to these threat actors. So what they basically said were that EU companies and organizations are not allowed to conduct business with either these organizations, and a list of those, or these people. The other one that we saw was the ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline. What happened there was Colonial Pipeline was a private organization, and the CEO of that company had to make the tough decision to pay the ransom to get the key. But as we know, the key sometimes may work, sometimes may not work, and even if it works, there are technologies that aren't developed to be encrypted. So having said that, they paid, they got the key, but what happened afterwards was really interesting. And that were response operations by US agencies that hit back on the organized crime group, took back some of the bitcoins, and suddenly it started to become a cost issue for the organized crime groups that they're actually losing their infrastructure. So these two cases really show that there are ways to retaliate, but they need to be, just as you mentioned earlier, you need to have all of these things in place. And I think I believe that one thing that we're seeing right now is just before, a couple of months before the 24th of February, we saw both the EU, certain US organizations, and the UK sending people with defense expertise to assist Ukraine. But we also have Microsoft, we also have some other countries, and they're on the front, some other companies there, and they're on the front lines learning these things, what operations are being conducted, targeting which software, hardware, because they can use that knowledge to protect our own infrastructure, because we're using the same software.
I would like to add that as far as I could see, for today we should focus our attention on two main points. First of all, resilience became more important than response and so on. And the second is that in a real military operation, I'm talking about the real missiles, etc., we have the new concept of network-centric war. Yeah, so the war with a set of small groups communicated and collaborated independently to reach the joint goal. And from my perspective, we should bring this idea of, if we talk about the cyber warfare, we should bring this idea from real military operations to cyber warfare. Instead of a big hierarchical, system, we should build a network of trust, a network of communication and collaboration, and of course, threat sharing as well.
So, well, looking into the future, how should we tackle these? Like, what should we bring with us from this discussion today? Like, what's the two key things? You mentioned resilience. Anything that, like, should it, because I think this is a question that should be brought up higher up than the discussion is today. It should be brought into every boardroom of every company in the world, highlighting these issues, because it's not just like infrastructure question for sure, like targeted, but it's on so many levels, and as you said, the supply chain attacks are increasing, so it might not be the the company itself, but it could be a third-party company that's being targeted. So, any other key takeaways?
I think one way to look at it is how are things being thought about today. So if we look at the EU diplomacy toolkit, what they say there is that every member state is responsible for their own cybersecurity. That's right. If we take that concept and apply it in one nation, then one could say that each organization is responsible for their own cybersecurity. And if you're in trouble, reach out, because this is also what the EU does. If you have troubles maintaining this, then we'll take in other member states' resources to help you out in your problem. So you really need to have, and I think someone earlier meant in one of the panels, cyber hygiene. So there are a lot of real basic stuff that need to be understood, but then we have this issue between, okay, the business wants something and the security wants something. Security as an enabler or security as a disabler. And these are essentially discussions, having worked in the physical part of security in the 2000s. One of the political advisors came to me and asked me, said to me, "You're costing us a lot of money. What are we getting from you?" And my response was, well, as long as no one's hurt, that's what you're getting. When someone is hurt, then you're either doing something wrong or you're not listening to what we're saying.
Yeah.
I have another angle from some of the clients that we are advising for the time being, and they're looking into what's going to happen next. Where will we have the next Russian-Ukraine situation? A situation that will mean something when it comes to maybe sanctions, will mean something to supply chains and so on. And they're very much looking towards China and the discussion between US and China, and particularly the China-Taiwanese issue. Because it's not a burning platform for the time being, but it's certainly looking into the horizon, something that would develop into, if not a similar situation, then at least a situation with consequences for businesses that could be comparable to what is happening now in Russia and Ukraine. So that's very much where their intention. They moved on and now looking to the future and see how can what can we do in order to reduce our vulnerabilities to our business models.
Another key takeaway I would say is that I would encourage businesses to exercise. If you, for example, take an analog from the military, it said that the armed forces, either they are fighting a war or they are preparing to fight a war. So how do they prepare? Well, one of the ways they are preparing is that they are exercising. Now, looking from a company perspective, having similar kind of exercises would be very important, and especially pushing out the very difficult questions. So have the leadership, the upper leadership, take part in these exercises and push the really hard questions to them and force them kind of to, in this scenario, make decisions. It's really an eye-opener for many.
Totally agree, yeah.
Yeah.
I think a very good case to look at what you're talking about is the Norsk Hydro case, where so if you look at studies in crisis management, it takes really around 2 weeks before the stakeholders, shareholders and people like that will really decide for you if the company is doing a good job or a bad job. You can do a great job, but it's really the impact and the perception of other people. And I recall one of the media shots that were being done. One of the high-level VPs of Norsk Hydro went down, sleeved up his shirt, went to one of the technicians and asked her, "Tell me what to do." And that's a good projection outwards. Then what really happened, I don't know, but it's a good case to look at what you just mentioned.
We are actually, time is up. Thank you so much for participating. I hope everyone thinks it was interesting. I for sure did. And have a great rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was, I think, one of the best panels. Lots of interesting discussion going on. So if you want to continue the discussion, you can get them on Hoover app, connect them and ask your questions.